What's up, Preacher Creatures? I am so excited to invite you to the inaugural episode of the Preacher Creature podcast. Welcome.
I'm so excited to be here with you, Jake. This is such an incredible opportunity and project that we're working on. My name is Ashley Lewis. I live in Durham, North Carolina. I graduated from Columbia Seminary, where I first met Jake. I'm currently in a post-seminary immersive learning program called Seminary of the Wild Earth, which is with the Wild Church Network. I've worked in both nonprofit and church ministry spaces over the last 6 years or so, and my ministry efforts focus on preaching and teaching beyond the human experience for the good of all creation.
And I'm Jake Myers. I teach homiletics at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. I'm in my 9th year there, and I love my job. It's so much fun. But I also offer preaching coaching to working preachers at thepreachingdoctor.com. So if you're looking to get a little bit of extra help in your sermon development or delivery, or just talking about your ministry at your church, feel free to hit me up. I'd love to work with you. Ashley and I have a great background. As a professor, you're not supposed to have favorites, but as soon as Ashley started here, she quickly became one of my favorite students. She won the preaching award that we offer to our seminary graduates during our graduation services, and has just taught me so much about preaching and about embodiment and all of those things. So I'm so delighted that we're getting to continue our friendship through this podcast.
It's really an honor, and really at the heart of it, I think, Jake, when you and I started working together, we found this enjoyment of just nerding out on the homiletical and all the people that you can do that with. I found kind of a home in that space, and so I'm just very honored to be able to continue that effort in this podcast and to bring it to the good of preachers everywhere. So really what we're aiming to do with this podcast is provide insights and a space or community for weary preachers. We're going to be covering books by homileticians and practitioners whose work can really help us energize and empower for compelling preaching.
Yeah, and this is a really exciting initiative that's a part of our work at Columbia Theological Seminary. Columbia was lucky enough to receive a very generous grant from the Lilly Endowment to support more compelling preaching. And so there are 3 kind of areas that we're working in to support the work that you all are doing in your churches and parishes. One is going to be focused on scripture engagement. So my colleague in homiletics at Columbia Theological Seminary, Dr. Anna Carter-Florence, and I will be traveling to different cities for the next 5 years, offering scripture engagement workshops. And if you know anything about Dr. Carter-Florence, you know that her way of getting into the text is extraordinary. So we're so excited about this opportunity. And then we're going to have the work that Ashley and I will be doing together. We'll be bringing digital content and creating online spaces for preachers to connect, to learn, to ask their questions, and to grow together. And then the third area, my spouse, Dr. Abby Myers, is a psychologist. And for the last 10 years, she's done a lot of work in equipping and empowering missionaries and other church leaders and attending to their mental and emotional health in their respective ministry contexts. So Abby and I will be leading every June a pilgrimage on the Camino de Santiago. So it'll be for 2 weeks in June, giving preachers an opportunity to get out of their locations, all the hustle and bustle of church life, and to just be, to reflect, to journey, and to reflect on where God is leading them for the next stage of their ministry. And then every January, we're going to be offering restorative mindfulness and yoga retreats for pastors. This will be 1-week experience in El Salvador. Both Abby and I are certified yoga instructors, and so it will be an opportunity for preachers to really reconnect with their bodies as well as their hearts and their minds, and to journey with other people who are going through the same kind of things in their ministries. So we're really excited about this grant. We're really excited that we get to offer this content for folks like you.
Speaking of content, you can find updates about all of these programs, including the Preacher Creature podcast, on social media. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at the handle @Preacher Studio for renewal. Make sure that you like and follow all of those posts so that you can be informed about the exciting things that we have going on, and really seeing Jake and Anna and Abby in their element on these projects. It's invigorating for all of us, and we hope that you as listeners and participants will be able to come along on the journey for as much of this as you possibly can.
Absolutely. And if you find this content helpful, please, if you're watching us on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so that you'll be able to continue to participate in what we're doing here. And if you find this helpful and maybe you want to hit that like button too, that helps us. It helps to mess with the algorithm so that people get more familiar with who we are and be able to access us. And also, if you wouldn't mind, if you have future topics that you'd like us to discuss, please write to us. Either a comment on the YouTube page or send us a message to let us know on social media what topics you'd like us to cover. If there's a new book that you think all preachers should know about, then please let us know, because we're really in this podcast going to be engaging authors whose work can really inform the work that you all are doing in your respective ministry contexts.
So I mentioned in this podcast, we're talking about new books that we believe every working preacher should be able to engage, which we think will support and empower their preaching ministries. So Jake, do you want to tell us about the author of our first book?
Yes, I would love to. Today, we are honored to be joined by the Reverend Dr. Brad Braxton. Dr. Braxton serves as the president and professor of public theology at Chicago Theological Seminary. He's a seasoned biblical scholar and homiletician and a fellow Emeroid. He did his PhD at Emory like I did. And he's the founder and senior pastor of the Open Church in Baltimore, Maryland. And this is a church that prioritizes radically inclusive love, courageous social justice activism, and compassionate interfaith activism. He's the author of numerous books on biblical interpretation and Black religion. And I got to say, I've been a fanboy of Dr. Braxton for many, many years. And in every time I teach the introduction to preaching course at Columbia Theological Seminary, we always engage his work to help our students understand that really important aspect called cultural hermeneutics. So how we draw our lived experience into our interpretation of the biblical text, which then shapes how we proclaim the text. So I'm really excited we're going to get to talk with Dr. Braxton today.
The book, which is newly published by Fortress Press, is called Open: Unorthodox Thoughts on God and Community. What we love about this book, well, I'll say what I love about it, is just it's so refreshing to encounter such unapologetic, progressive theology and ecclesiology. We get a lot of autobiographical information about Dr. Braxton. He talks about his experience with the Open Church and with his projects at the Smithsonian Institution, and different churches that he has been a pastor. So really leadership experience is included in this book too. And all the way through, I just found myself so encouraged and empowered by the way that he experiences ministry, just being unapologetically open and progressive. And he makes a really strong case for really pursuing that at all costs, because he has the peace of knowing that above anything else is really the heavenly call. It's the holy call. So just journeying with him through these different ideas and experiences has given me a lot of encouragement and restoration.
Yeah, I felt the exact same way. My wife jokes at me that I'm not able to actually read unless I have a pen or a highlighter in my hand. And my copy of the book is littered with notes and dog ears and tabs, and because there's so much that can restore and rejuvenate preaching that he offers in this book. And one of the things I really love about it, he unapologetically takes what he calls a theopoetical approach in the book. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, so Theopoetics is kind of a way of thinking about our life of faith and praxis that's distinct from theology. And if you were a Greek nerd, you know that theos means God, and then logos means like rationality or words, right? So theology would be words about God. But the word poetics comes from the Greek word poiesis, which means to do or to make. So it's less about thinking about static concepts of who God is, but rather thinking about taking our understanding of God and manifesting that out into the world. And that's very much what he's doing here. He's not just telling you about concepts, but he's showing you how these concepts can take ground and take embodiment in flesh in lived experience with God. And I love that approach. I love how he set it all up. And I know that you'll appreciate it once we get to talk to him.
Definitely. in talking about Theopoetics, I thought the way that he brought in God's claiming creation as good, that the first thing that we see in scripture is God as artist creating things and then stepping back and calling it good. And so this idea that in Theopoetics and a theopoetical approach, we can be concerned with the good, the aesthetic, in a sense that it is enriching for us, that we can involve all of our senses and that we can kind of delight as God does, especially when it comes to our relationship to creation and to each other in community. That was really a new way of thinking for me that I'm excited to continue to explore. And another piece that I love in this book is the way that religious pluralism or faith pluralism takes really front row. It's like right at the front of all of these conversations. And one of the images I think that we'll talk more about, and that is involved in Theopoetics too, is this idea that that music is the way that he thinks about the life of faith. So in pluralism, there's this symphony of voices. In Theopoetics, he says, like, does this hum? Does it have that hum and that beauty of music making in the process of lived theology? So yeah, there's a lot to explore, and I can't wait to hear him talk more about that. And it makes me think too about his exploration of ancestral spiritualities, the mystic, even talking about bringing science into the conversation, as he has done this work with the Smithsonian Institution, involving the scientific in our understanding of faith. So one of the things he brings up is this idea that if we are searching for the spiritual activity in our lives and in our communities, we have to be attentive to the invisible as well as the visible. And so one of the ways that he describes this is thinking about, on a quantum level, how there are things happening that we can't even understand or explain, like these quantum energy packets that scientists have proven exist. And who knows, could be a way that the spirit is moving in the realms beyond what we can see. And so to take, progressive theology and this mystical approach, this exploration of his ancestral spiritualities, is just, it opens up so many pathways to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just him kind of waxing eloquently about, his experiences or these mystical concepts that he so amazingly brings in. It's to use those concepts to help think more critically and creatively about our theological concepts. So for instance, I wanted to read you this one quote. We won't read you a lot of quotes, but this one is really good. He's talking about Christology here, and he says, "Judged by orthodoxy, my assertions are heretical. It has been said that heresy is the revenge of a suppressed truth. Too often we live by truths that are greatly reduced. Thus, the promotion of heresy might lead to holiness, or at least move us toward wholeness, if it brings to light suppressed truths that expand our appreciation for the robust revelation of a capacious God." I love that. I love that idea. And I love how he's already messing with our categories. We tend to think of like orthodoxies over here and heterodoxies over here, or, faithfulness is here and heresies over here. But he's showing how it's almost in a process of deconstruction, how by peeling back the layers of the theological onion, we're able to see the things that are no longer life-giving for us, and things that are actually keeping us from being in right relationship with God and the created order. So I just love that idea.
Yeah, and the way that everything he's doing is also rooted in the community. He does recognize even that some of the ways that openness challenges us, that just because even that the open church was founded on these ideas doesn't mean they don't have hesitations and concerns and fears that they then also have to work through. And so he talks about even their church, as successful as it's been, in the metrics and in the spiritual life, there it still feels sometimes like it's on shaky ground. And those are lessons I think that many of us can be encouraged by as we look at the challenges before the church, and that even from somebody as seasoned, as dedicated, as thoughtful as he is, he still comes forward and says, this isn't easy. Just because we have this openness in our foundation, in the mission and values of the church, doesn't mean we don't struggle with the same things that all other churches do. And
Yeah.
yet he's really still making a case for how redemptive this approach to life and ministry and community can be.
Yeah, and absolutely, and in some ways, he's the perfect person to be on our inaugural episode of the Preacher Creature podcast, because sometimes, like I'm a homiletician, so I have a nice faculty position at Columbia Seminary. You can kind of lose touch with what's going on in actual congregational contexts, but he is a hybrid character in that he's both a professor of practical theology, homiletics, and Bible, but he's also a pastor. So these ideas aren't just like things that he thought up when he was, sipping his latte, musing about the mysteries of God and the world. He's tried this stuff out, and he's had failures that he's willing to name. And out of those failures, new questions have emerged that have led to new ways of thinking about preaching and proclamation. And it's that kind of intersection of theory and practice that we absolutely want to forefront and to celebrate. And so I'm so excited. We're going to invite Dr. Braxton in, and we'll get started with our interview. Dr. Braxton, thank you so much for joining us. I would love to start off by hearing a little bit about why you decided to write this book, and what you hope that it will achieve in the hearts and minds of your readers.
Thank you so much for having me and for your interest in the book. Primarily, I wrote the book because I realized that if I didn't write the book, I would not meet the ancestors well when my time came. That this really is a book for me about legacy. It is a compilation of the thinking and the practices I have been engaged in now for more than 20 years. And it struck me that it was time to codify it and to put it down. And as I say, legacy, although I'd like to think I have a lot of juice left, I have arguably more days behind me than ahead of me. So our daughter, as I was writing this book, our daughter was in her late teenage years, and it struck me as important to think about legacy. What of me will be left when I am left? And I've been so deeply impacted, for example, by Howard Thurman's book, Footprints of a Dream. And it was one of the very first books that we read when we were beginning the Open Church of Maryland. And so many people were encouraging me that we needed to do something similar, to codify these thoughts around progressive ways of understanding God, open ways of understanding God and community. So hopefully this contributes in some meaningful way to a positive aspect.
It definitely will. And I have a 17-year-old daughter myself. So when you were talking about your daughter and the kind of role model that you're seeking to become for her, I was thinking about it in an existential and fatherly way, in addition to being a scholar and a preacher. And that kind of touches upon something that runs through the whole book, which is your love of Theopoetics, which I share, and which I don't see a lot of in many seminary and divinity school contexts. And you make this claim on page 125 that I just have to read. You talk about humans are perhaps most godlike when we create or contribute to the good and the beautiful in personal, public, and environmental spheres. I'd love to hear you say more about this deeply theological claim and how it might play out for preachers to think about incorporating poetry and political theology into our sermons.
Jake, thank you for that question. There is a pedagogical practice that I have been engaging in now for more than 20 years. For example, when I teach Introduction to Preaching, I begin every class session with the West African proverb that says, Where there is no music,
Yeah.
the Spirit will not come. I know we're talking about preaching, and I'm about ready to start preaching. I feel it. I feel it. Where there is no music, the Spirit will not come. And spirit can, of course, be very elastic. It can be in a more traditional Christian way of thinking about the pneuma, or it could be the spirit of fellowship, the spirit of harmony, the spirit of righteous troublemaking. So I've used this in many settings, but particularly classroom settings. And that particular chapter in Open really had a lot to do with when I was actually a grant maker at the Ford Foundation, when I had kind of left the academy for a while, although deeply involved in many of the conversations and actually resourcing many theological endeavors through the Ford Foundation's grant making project. I was in my very first meeting at the Ford Foundation. And as I lay it out in the chapter, it was wonderful to be in that historic building in New York City and hearing all of these wonderful conversations. But I heard the Spirit say to me as I was in this corporate conference room with policymakers and analysts and attorneys, the Spirit said to me, I'm not quite sure I hear any music just yet. I don't hear anything humming right now. And so it was a marvelous kind of intervention when I actually asked that question, because part of personal and societal transformation is about making space for the creativity of the Spirit, broadly defined. So there is a profound kind of cultural and theological underpinning to my deep affinity for theopoetics. I would also say, and as I was thinking about our conversation today, I said, you know, Jake and Ashley are my friends, but their wonderful questions are a setup, because each of these questions is a podcast unto itself. So I know you all are trying to trick me and see if I can actually come in like under 5 minutes each time. But I did want to say that the African-American preaching tradition that so sponsors my homiletic and furnishes my soul and just inspires me is a tradition deeply rooted both in the apprenticeship kind of process and in a profound theopoetics. So as you know, I'm deeply committed to the intellectual endeavor and have taught homiletics at the PhD level. And yet I say with great pride, I learned my most significant homiletics at 226 South Broad Street, a little Baptist church in Salem, Virginia, about 30,000 people where I'm from, in those beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains in Southwest Virginia. My father was a world-class pastor and a solid week-to-week preacher. And those services, I can still see those tan pews and that red carpet. Those services were saturated with pageantry, music, body swaying. There is a theorist who says that we come to drama because of our thirst for the absolute. And I first learned theopoetics in a little Baptist church in Southwest Virginia. The sights, the sounds, the textures. And so this is what I have tried to bring to the teaching of preaching. Now I'll be a little more explicitly theological. I ground my homiletic in creativity because the first thing we learn in Jewish and Christian scripture is that God is creative. Long before we get to the grammar of redemption story, we get the grammar of creation story. So in introduction to preaching, I say lovingly, jokingly, and quite seriously to preachers, there is only one unforgivable homiletic sin. And it is the sin of being
Absolutely. Yeah.
Nothing dishonors God more than boring preaching. So, as a homiletician, I have developed practices around embodiment and kinesthetics. I'm so deeply indebted to a great mentor. One of the most significant homileticians and scholars of our generation is Dr. Martha Simmons there in Atlanta. And years ago, Dr. Simmons said to me this, and I've been teaching students this for decades now. She says, if the gospel is really good news, then your
Yes.
body ought to
That's well
get
said.
in on the action. Because if it's really that good, like if we believe, we're in the season of Easter, if we believe that God has tomb raiding power, then how can we simply stand at a lectern as if we're holding on for our dear life and preach it stiff? Preach it
Right.
in the form of death
Amen.
when we are trying to talk about life. So if the fact that the spirit that raised Jesus from the dead is alive in me, then let your body get in on the action. And so one of the exercises that I most delight in and that students say they greatly appreciate, although it is very challenging, is the exercise of preaching with no words. So to teach Theopoetics, I one day in class will say, I'll use something from Isaiah. With joy, let us draw water from the wells of salvation. That's the text for today. And for the next 3 minutes, each of you has to preach
Yes.
this text with no words.
That's awesome.
Right.
And preachers struggle with it across denominations and cultures and genders and various identities. But the goal is to help preachers become more comfortable in their body so that preaching is indeed an embodied tangibilization of our audacious proclamation.
Yes.
And I know scholars will say tangibilization isn't a word, but it is.
Now.
Trust me, it is. It's a word. It is now.
It's so inspiring to just be here and have this word given to us that we're also sharing with our listeners. But to be here firsthand is extra special too. And talking about that movement, I think, and how you're really grounded in these Black traditions that have instilled these values and beliefs in you and really come alive. And I think even imagining students in the classroom as a white like a white person, I know this is something that can put white people outside of their comfort zone quite a lot. And so in thinking about just that tension that you have had to navigate, particularly you talk about in the epilogue of your book as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, and the hegemony of whiteness and white ideologies that you were really surrounded by. And you say that in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways, the message was conveyed there that white culture experiences were the measuring rod. And I felt that to be such a poignant way of conveying how whiteness operates to demean and devalue people and their diverse cultural experiences, which we should treat as gifts to God's kingdom, not oddities. So would love to get into that conversation a bit about how your time in Gambia opened your eyes and ears to imagine another way of being in the world, your time convening with the ancestors, and how the music of that came to be that Christianity was no longer just the only voice. It was still an important one, but you talk about the chorus that came about. So can you say more about how that occurred and how you hold your Christian identity with your Afrocentric identity and generative tension, and what folks from all cultures can learn from that today?
What a beautiful question. Thank you, Ashley. I'm delighted to talk about this, not the least of which my wife, daughter, and I just recently went on a family vacation to England. Now that our daughter is a university student, we thought it was very important for her to begin to understand some of these trajectories and pathways and some of the energy that has impacted us as her parents. And it was a beautiful trip. But when I went to the University of Oxford in the fall of 1991 on a Rhodes Scholarship, it was the most remarkable and life-changing moment perhaps I've ever had in terms of intellectual development. And I was able, when I returned to England just a few weeks ago, to see my teacher, Professor Christopher Rowland. So what a great gift it was to study at the University of Oxford. And as you picked up from the text of Open, I was viscerally impacted by being in the center of Eurocentrism. Now, I understand how whiteness works because, as I've alluded to already, I'm from Virginia. And Virginia is one of the most marvelous places in the world. And more than one thing can be true. It was the seat of the Confederacy when our country brutalized itself over the freedom question concerning enslaved persons. So I've known how whiteness works, but when you're in a place like Oxford, it's a whole nother thing. And so my colleague, my beloved colleague and dear friend, Dr. Peter Henry, and I realized that we weren't going to survive this psychologically unless we made a trip to Mother Africa. And it was that experience in the Gambia when I am literally laboring, trying to figure out what my Master of Philosophy thesis will be, that as I'm reading the Greek text of Galatians, where Paul says, you are no longer slaves, I had my first mystical experience of the visitation of the African ancestors. And I appreciate, Jake, that you mentioned to this day that you use no longer slaves in your classes. That so impacts me. And that is also a testimony to the potency of that mystical experience. We know in the academy, particularly the Theological Academy, we're fortunate if our books sometimes stay in circulation for a couple of years. No Longer Slaves is now 22 years old. It was published in 2002. That has nothing to do with me. That has everything to do with you better pay attention to the ancestors when they speak to you. It's about the potency of the revelation that came from the ancestors. And so as I was working through that thesis that would then become the book based on that visitation, I have a line in No Longer Slaves. And it was one of those lines where I was really trying to pick a fight with my own rather moderate and kind of conservative way of thinking about Christology. And that line is, based on my experience, the first place that Black folk met God was not at the foot of the cross. So my cosmology was transformed in that moment. And then the theological premise that kind of radiates from that really is the animating energy in the book Open, is that God, or the sacred, is capacious. The divine is not a zero-sum game. And as I was reflecting on this conversation, as one who is deeply, deeply committed to language as not simply describing reality, but creating reality, I was reflecting in my morning meditation about how our language has been so influenced by financial markets. So here's an example. Many of us, if we've got good sense, we're going to plug in to the women's NCAA Final Four. Like, I'm going to be watching that thing tonight. And the men as well, but I'm going to really pay attention to the women's game. But if you listen to many of the commentators, NBA, NCAA, you'll often hear sports commentators say, look at the product that team is putting on the floor, the product, right? Experience being commodified. And because of that, then what ends up happening, truth becomes a product. It becomes something that can be commodified, and therefore there is competition in the market. What if we approached the process of gaining moral wisdom and moving toward right relationship with one another, with everything that is sacred and the planet, as iterative, as additive, not competitive? There's a good friend who blessed my life. He's gone on to the great life. Dr. James Dunn at Wake Forest University used to say, we Christians sing, I have decided to follow Jesus. And Dr. Dunn would say, really? You decided just once? He's like, I need to decide every day, sometimes several times during the day. So authentic moral maturation is an iterative process. Even within our own native traditions, we need to keep trying to figure out what it's saying to us and what it's calling from us. And then it can also be additive. So I have added and expanded my understanding of the sacred. It has sharpened and deepened my thinking about pneumatology. So my understanding of kind of Christian spirit has been enhanced by my understanding of how spirit works in African traditional religions. My cosmology has been
Yes.
enhanced, my sense of mysticism. So I say now to preachers, if you're preaching as if you're only talking to Brother Jones and Sister Washington on the third row, your
Yeah.
homiletic is far too anthropological. We're supposed to be preaching to get conversion from the principalities and powers as well. So it has expanded and given energy to my way of thinking. And I would finally say this. I believe it is R.S. Sugatharaja, and I reference him and have been deeply impacted by him, a great post-colonial scholar who says, so often we approach this again in a competitive way. It's almost like it's a final four, right? It's Buddha versus Jesus and Muhammad versus Moses, and there's got to be some winner. But Sugatharaja says that approach makes it possible for evil to win, because evil is very savvy. And so evil will set in the cut and say, I'm just going to let all those religionists fight among themselves while we do all the damage we need. What if we're going to be competitive, said, it's really about righteousness, goodness, and love, resisting greed, arrogance, and hatred. And any spiritual, religious, ethical tradition, life stance that's on the side of righteousness, goodness, and love,
that's right.
I'm rocking with them. I'm down with that.
Wow, that's fantastic. So, Brad, the essays in this volume are all spectacular, but there's one in particular that I'm going to start assigning to all of my preaching students, and that is your chapter on sanctification and proclamation. And I love this idea that you have that what causes us to lack the capacity to proclaim in a creative and compelling way arises from a kind of malnourished spirituality. And you talk about preachers who fail to practice what you call REM, which stands for resting, embracing, and meditating. And you state so eloquently that these preachers are not really walking with God. We're sleepwalking on the job because our creativity has been so dulled. And that when we're REM deficient, our words come out slow and stagnant because we're sleepwalking. What wisdom might you offer busy pastors or busy aspiring preachers about how to cultivate the practices of REM, and how have you seen it play out in your life and ministry?
Thank you, Jake. Let me first, as a response to this, thank you for noting that it might be of use to you and your teaching practice. And it really is a time to shout out all of the beautiful and brilliant students. On the paper, on the syllabi, it said that I was the teacher, but I'm very clear that they were the teachers. And I want to say that because this essay actually began as one of the key early lectures. I believe it typically was the second lecture in my introduction to preaching class. And year after year, sometimes I would talk openly to students about, I'm thinking about revising the syllabus, etc. And generations of students have said to me, whatever else you do, never delete this lecture. You must always give this lecture, because they realized that the lecture was actually an attempt to quell the understandable anxiety of the preacher around craft, methodology, how. And so often, and even in our moments of enriching preachers and conferences, we spend a lot of time talking about how, but not nearly enough time talking about the why of preaching. And so, in terms of helping busy pastors, I still am one. I first would remind us that one way of thinking biblically about the office is it's not just the office of pastor, it's the office of pastor and teacher. Eugene Peterson's marvelous book on the contemplative pastor so enriched me in the early days of my first pastorate. And what Peterson says is busy, when used to describe pastor, is not necessarily a compliment. So first of all, we have to deconstruct what it means to be a pastor. And of course, the laundry list of tasks are extraordinarily long. But part of being a pastor is to also be a teacher and to help grow a community or a congregation along with you to the necessary time to be still, to be quiet, to be, as Peterson says, contemplative. And so here's the way that I would say, and I really work on these kinds of nuggets of advice to students. One of the things that allows me to rest is the realization that I believe early in my ministry, again, I had some mystical moments when I felt as if God was asking me this: can I trust you, Brad, with revelation?
Yeah.
Okay, that was an ethical question. Can I trust you? And one of the ways that I believe God tested me, and again, I don't want to speak for how it works for any other preacher, but I'm pretty clear on what was going on early in my ministry. We can get very pious, any way you want to use me, God, anytime you want to speak to me. And so it was so strange that some of my most powerful moments of revelation would come at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. I'd wake up and then all of a sudden stuff would be. And so God said, okay, I just want to know, can I trust you with revelation? Because you said anytime, anyway. And so what I began to do is to try to be faithful. Okay, God, I know you are kind of messing with my sleep and my rest right through in here, but I'm going to get these ideas. I'm going to get these thoughts. And many of those have ended up to be sermons that I preach even to this day. And people still say, oh, Reverend, there's still something in that. And so when God then knows that God can trust you with revelation, then you can engage in a dialogue and say, now, God, since I've demonstrated to you that you can trust me, will you now leave me alone so I can go to sleep? I'm going to work on this because I've got the nugget here. I got it. I got it captured in a text message to myself. I put it on some notepads, and now I'm going to rest, because for me to execute this idea and the profundity of it, I've got to offer you a clear mind and a rested body. Preachers must also, Jake, take active control of their schedule. For years, starting from in my first pastorate, I didn't lie. I just was creative. I literally marked meeting in my calendar around sermon preparation and meditation. One of the first things I would do when I was a pastor at Douglas Memorial back in the mid to late 90s, I would often begin on Monday morning. It was meeting time, and I went to St. Mary's Library in the northern part of Baltimore City, and I would just look at what the theological journals and what's going on in the humanities and the sciences, and that was a meeting. And so if somebody said, Reverend, we need you to do something on Monday morning at 10 o'clock, I would love to do it. Can we do it later? I have a meeting. Take active control of your schedule. As it relates to the embracing of our shadow side, it is utterly important for preachers to cultivate a wisdom circle. People who are not impressed with your press clippings, people who are not intimidated to hold you accountable and tell you the truth. As I have often said on many occasions, one day when I got really arrogant, my wife Lizetta kind of pulled me aside and she said, there has not been an expansion in the Trinity. Bring your ego down.
Spouses are great for that.
Come on down. You got feet of clay, right? Just like the rest of us. So it can be a spouse, a partner. It can be members and friends of the congregation. It can be colleagues. It can be a therapist. Develop a wisdom circle that will help you embrace your shadow side, because often your greatest strength, as the ancients would say, is your greatest weakness. And then on the meditating, Howard Thurman says it best: avoid the dangerous magic of too much activity. So for me, meditating now is about holy focus. I am a very early riser, right? I'm typically at my desk 3:34 a.m. in the morning. And so that means I often walk our dog Samson at 2:30 in the morning, 4. Now I find a way to get an afternoon nap in there as well. No doubt about that. But on the morning walk, as I'm walking our dog, I have holy focus and my mind is still. And it has gotten such that I almost have to, like, I'll be walking and all of a sudden I've got to see one of those recording apps, because the revelation will come so fast and furious. And it's not just about revelation about what am I going to preach this week. It's revelation about how am I going to be a better person. And that comes from meditating and holy focus. Even though I'm actually walking, in the words of Thurman, I'm sitting still and watching myself go by and asking myself, do I like what I see?
That's great.
That was, awesome. That moment in the book was so helpful for me. I feel like post-seminary, that part, the shadow self side of the work has really just come in front of me. Like, I cannot get away from it these days. And as much as it's a challenge to engage in that, it feels like if I don't, I cannot be trusted. It's so necessary, and I will be grateful for it, even though in the moment it can feel burdensome. But thank you so much for those meditations. It's just like life lessons here. It's essential. I think Jake and I both struggled when reading your book not to underline every single sentence. It's like a coloring book over here. Some of the pages. There is so much wisdom that you share. And one of the favorite quotes that we picked out comes to us early in the book around kind of fencing off God. And I'm going to read it, this quote, because I want to get the words right, if that's okay. You say, attempts to fence in or place gates around a great big God diminish us spiritually and make us more prone to small-mindedness and mean-spiritedness. Many religious people specialize in installing fences and gates around God and our communities. These people function as if God is so frail that God cannot withstand robust contact with the real world, which is full of marvelously diverse people, practices, and principles. And God does not need our protection, our fences, or our gates. And that is just something to keep with us all the time. So important, and I think easy even in a progressive theological spaces to still feel like we have to protect God from what's out there. So could you expand on that a bit more and maybe tell us how this plays out, not only in preaching contexts, but also in how we engage the world beyond the pulpit and beyond the church walls?
Oh, absolutely. In this response, I'm going to attempt to show you all that I actually can be disciplined in my responses, right? You all have been very generous in listening to me. I get very excited, right? I should have more passion about these topics. I know, but just a little more. But I'm going to put this in a to-go box in this way. Fundamentally, what is underneath those sentences and that way of thinking and being is a commitment to two values that really animate the book and that are animating my life. And the first is humility. Humility, staying close to the ground, realizing, as one of the great preachers who blessed my life said, all of us are just walking clay. We've all got reservations for the cemetery, as he said, without the privilege of cancellation. So at best, humility says, I only have a fragment of truth if I have that at all. And second, curiosity. What will I not know about God and goodness unless I listen to and learn from you? That's open. That's the book. I mean, there are lots of turns. Hopefully there's some delicious turns, maybe more turns than an Alabama back road, right? I mean, there's some stuff going on in there. There's a lot of fun. I hope it's playful and hopefully revelatory, but that's it in a to-go box. Humility. And because I only have a fragment of truth, if I'm interested in robust truth, I must connect with your truth. And so very practically, I'm really pleased that last year I was also able to publish a second book. I co-authored a book with Dr. Tony Penn titled A Master Class on Being Human, a Black Christian and a Black secular humanist on religion, race, and justice. So open and a master class are for me two sides of the same coin, right? In open, I'm kind of working and nudging and thinking through progressive Christianity by and large, even though there's a lot of turns, as we've talked about, towards pluralism and the interreligious work that is so much a part of my work as the pastor of the Open Church, as president of Chicago Theological Seminary. This other book, A Masterclass on Being Human, is the other side of the coin. So in the most troubling days of the pandemic, I co-wrote a book with one of the world's most erudite and prolific secular humanists. And the reason that we wrote the book is that we realized that theist and non-theist have engaged in combat for too long, that zero-sum game. But what does it look like to engage difference, as Tony so brilliantly says, not as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to be embraced? My most significant tutor of late has been a brother beloved and a world-class scholar who does not believe in God.
Wow.
And I am the better for that engagement. So when we talk about a masterclass, it's not like, hey, we've got all the answers. It's precisely being in the classroom with sacred siblings from a variety of ethical and spiritual traditions and chopping it up, not through coercion, but through creative, deep, active listening. So as much as we preachers like to talk, maybe we should, as I have named myself at Chicago Theological Seminary, seek to be our community's chief listening officers.
Wow, and that ties in so well with something you said in the book, which is a really poignant image that you said you share with your preaching students, that to imagine every time we proclaim God's word, that there's a heavenly stenographer who is watching and recording everything that we say, and that in the by and by, when we're standing before God's judgment bar, preachers will have to answer for every time that we opened our mouths to bless or curse someone. And this is such a sobering thought to imagine. And I'm sort of like playing through sermons I've preached before, and I'm probably rightly nervous about that experience. But I'd love to hear you reflect more about preaching with imagination and to use your language as a kind of guerrilla warfare for the good. Where we're not staging a frontal attack, but we're kind of coming at it sideways. Help us to think more about this. I think it's a really important concept.
Thank you so much for that question. I cut my teeth as a homiletician in a beautiful first professorial appointment at Wake Forest University School of Divinity, and great university where there are other professional schools. And so early in my career as a teacher of preaching, I began to theorize preaching, its practice and the teaching of that practice in terms of the great professions. Teaching itself a great profession, the profession around medicine, right? The practice of medicine. The practice of medicine is very important to me because at its best, preaching is a healing art. And so for me, I take seriously and actually ask the students who journey with me and are also my teachers for us all to take the homiletic Hippocratic oath.
Yeah,
that's good.
No.
Do no harm. Right? So if you take your language practices as an opportunity to do important surgery, and I've had some really significant health challenges, right? I am pleased to say that thanks be to God, I've had some marvelous surgeons who've done some marvelous work. And after a very serious moment, I had a surgeon, because I had a wound and I wasn't sure what was going on. And the surgeon said to me, "Oh no, you're on the way to healing, because in order for wounds to heal, wounds have to weep."
Wow.
What if we approached our language practices as if we are skilled surgeons with scalpels, and there is profound pathology in the body politic that needs not butchers here, skilled surgeons, and who will do no harm. Now, I'm going to be very honest as well, thinking about this again through the professions. Those surgeons did hurt me. But they did not harm me. Right? And so sometimes when we are dealing with these profound existential and political and cultural issues, we are going to have to engender some discomfort, even as we feel it ourselves, all in the name of healing. So first, thinking through the great professions and situating preaching in that tradition. And then thinking about imagination. So when people ask me, what do I do for a living? My, again, to-go box answer is, I teach imagination for a living. And it is a marvelous, marvelous career. It's just a great profession. So imagination, here's how I define it, at least one way to define it. Imagination is not just flights of fancy. Imagination is paying attention to what is, grammatically, indicative mood, for the sake of what may be, grammatically, the subjunctive mood. So one of my exercises in introduction to preaching is I ask preachers to literally, when we were meeting in person, right, I would say, all right, you've got 20 minutes now, go all over campus as far as you can go in about 10 minutes, and then make the 10-minute journey back and just observe. Pay attention. And then they would come back with the field notes. Again, y'all, I feel like preaching. I feel like preaching. They would bring back field notes. And I'd say, okay, what did you see out on that part of the quadrant of campus, whatever? And they would feed it back to me. And we were working with one text. We might be working with Mark 1 that day, maybe the story of Jesus' baptism. And whatever they gave me on the spot, I would develop a 2 or 3 sentence sermon introduction. And they would say, Doc, how do you do that? I just have been exercising my imagination muscle. And that part of this, quote, guerrilla warfare is to realize that human transformation often happens not through frontal attack, right? It's the psychology of transformation. It's often, to use, I believe it was the poet Emily Dickinson, you got to tell truth on the slant sometimes, right? And sometimes you got to come at it this way, because if you come at it this way, people's defenses will come up. So how do you do it on the slant such that, and that's what Jesus was doing, again, as Peterson says, Eugene Peterson, as he talks about the parables. The parables are so powerful even to this day, millennia later, because it's truth on the slant. It's gospel guerrilla warfare. Poetic indirection, not the heresy of exactness.
Talking about that creative energy. You probably noticed the name of this podcast is Preacher Creature, which is not only a fun play on words, even though it is, but it's also a theological proclamation about preacherliness as the position from which we preach. And for me, it reminds me of that humility that you speak of, that we all must have, not only as a preacher, doing my best to proclaim the word of God, but also as one creature among many with a responsibility to the well-being of fellow creatures and ecologies, human and beyond, with every word that we preach. So you include a brilliant sermon in this book. It's called A Gift for Mother Earth, Clean Your Room. And the creative expression of something so familiar to all of us as the call from our mothers to clean up our room, and then thinking about Mother Earth as, mother's womb birthplace, but also the place where we live, the room that we live in. And I'm going to let you talk about the sermon from there. But could you tell our listeners a little bit about how the sermon functions? Anything you can share about how it came to be? And particularly, if you can comment on this ecclesial and ecological responsibility that we have, not just as preachers to pull one Earth Day sermon out each year, but really as those with an opportunity to weave these values into our preaching all the time, just like other justice values that we hold, because I think you do that so well in this book and your work overall. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Oh, gladly, I will do so. The universe must have had a prelude of this conversation, because my screensaver, as I'm logging on for this conversation, was a multi-hued
How beautiful.
hummingbird
Wow.
floating in the air.
Yes.
So I just wanted to note that something is going on in the cosmos. I will also say that sermon for me was an attempt to again respond appropriately in a way that might make the ancestors pleased. How could I, in dealing with the legacy of what I've been about as an open theologian, not attempt to speak to address the existential ethical issue of our time, the well-being, the survivability of our host, of our mother. And so it is an attempt in this sermon to think about ecology as stewardship, humility, reverential care, as opposed to what we sometimes, quite often actually, have done in terms of creation, and that has been domination and exploitation. And so for me, it was an opportunity also, as someone who has spent decades trying to sort through the meanings of the ministry and writings of the Apostle Paul, to bring together a maternal image that Paul uses. And there are places where Paul makes these maternal, poetic moves, and to bring the ancient maternal image in Romans 8 as creation as a lady in labor with the feminist theology of Sally McFague, and bringing those together and saying, what if Earth is our mother's womb? And what we know anatomically is that things pass from the mother to the child through the umbilical cord. And because of this, we are literally right now engaging in ruinous behavior of the reproductive capacity of our mother's womb. And to think about this with the richness, and the ethical power of those images provides new energy for, just as you say, this is not something you do one Sunday a year. This must become the very bedrock of our ethic for the planet's survival. And as Sally McFague so rightly says, Eden is about mythological goodness, divine goodness, It's a myth about divine goodness. And sin is humanity's unwillingness to stay in our place.
Wow.
And as I was working towards that sermon, thinking about it, and then in work after it, here's what came to me. I'm not sure right now that I can ethically and in good conscience baptize anyone, because, as I like to say, the baptismal waters are polluted.
Yes.
Literally, in terms of the contaminants we've placed in the water, and figuratively, in terms of the spiritual contaminants of contempt and hate. So we need to be very careful how we taking people down. because we may be
Wow.
dipping them in toxicity
Yeah.
that needs to
Boy, that's
be
good.
purified.
That's a book right there. When's that one coming out?
I'm gonna get to work on
Okay.
that one. How about we co-author that book? That's good. I believe deeply in
Oh, no. This
collaboration.
conversation's been just collaborative genius. So thank you.
Yeah, and Brad, this is our very first episode
delight.
of the Preacher Creature podcast, and I feel like you have set us on a trajectory that I am so excited to journey on and to see what other wisdom our fellow colleagues and preachers are going to be able to offer to support the work of preaching, which is a really exciting and rewarding and challenging and sometimes lonely occupation. So thank you for sharing your time with us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Preachers, go get Open by Fortress Press. It is an amazing book, and it will recharge you and inspire you to proclaim God's word for all it's worth. So thank you, Brad, for your time and for your thoughtfulness. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Can't wait to talk again soon.